Arizona, 1875, was a land of vast horizons and silent valleys where a man's name could be forgotten by the wind just as quickly as it was spoken. Daniel Brooks, a cowboy hardened by long days under the sun and longer nights under cold stars, had grown used to the rhythm of solitude. His horse was his only companion, and the creak of saddle leather was often the only song in his world. Yet fate had a way of altering even the simplest rides home. And that evening, as he guided his horse down a rocky trail, he caught sight of something unusual, movement near a dry creek bed where nothing should have stirred. He slowed his horse, suspicion etched in his every motion, until he saw her, a woman crumpled against the earth, her skin pale with blood loss, her breathing shallow, but her eyes aflame with a strength that even pain could not extinguish. For a moment, Daniel froze, torn between instinct and caution. He knew the whispers that ran through every frontier town. Helping a native meant risking your life. To some, they were enemies. To others, shadows better left untouched. But as he looked down at her wound, the blood staining the sand beneath her, he couldn't turn away. Dismounting, he knelt beside her, careful but resolute. The bullet wound in her side was messy, not fatal yet, but close enough to death's edge that without help she wouldn't see another sunrise. She tried to push his hands away, defiant even in her weakness, but her strength faltered. Daniel tore strips from his own shirt, pressing them to the wound, his hands steady though his heart raced. She didn't speak his language fully, yet her eyes told him everything: suspicion, pain, and beneath it, a flicker of reluctant trust. The sun slipped lower as he worked, and the desert air cooled into the sharp bite of night. Daniel carried her to a sheltered patch by a cluster of rocks, building a fire to ward off the cold. He kept her close to its glow, watching as her breathing evened slightly, though each exhale was heavy with exhaustion. He cooked what little food he had, offering broth slowly, careful not to overwhelm her. She took only a few sips before leaning back, her eyes fluttering shut. The silence pressed heavily on Daniel, yet his resolve did not waver. He had chosen this path, chosen to risk everything for the life of a stranger who, by the laws of the land, many considered an enemy. Still, something deeper told him this was no enemy at all. She was flesh, blood, and spirit, caught in the cruel crossfire of a hunter's bullet. The hours dragged on, each marked by the crackle of firewood and the shifting of his horse nearby. Daniel kept his vigil, refreshing the cloth on her wound, speaking quietly, though he knew she might not understand his words. He told her about the stars, about the cattle he once tended, about the silence of a man who had walked too many trails alone. Perhaps it was madness, or perhaps it was mercy, but he needed her to hear a human voice, to remind her that she wasn't fading into the night alone. And as the firelight flickered across her face, Daniel realized how young she was, no older than her mid-20s, yet already bearing the weight of scars and battles. Near midnight, she stirred, her lips parting as though she wished to speak. The words came slowly, broken but clear enough. "Why, help me," she whispered, her voice like dry reeds. Daniel hesitated, staring into her fierce eyes before answering simply, "Because you're alive." "That's reason enough." For a moment, the fire seemed to hold its breath, and though she said nothing more, her gaze softened. It was not gratitude yet. It was something sharper, something that acknowledged both the danger he invited and the humanity he refused to deny. The night wore on, Daniel fighting his own exhaustion. He added more wood to the fire, checked her bandages, and listened to the coyotes calling in the distance. At times, he thought about riding away, about leaving her fate to chance and reclaiming his solitude. But each time he looked at her, he knew he couldn't. A man could live his whole life by rules written by fear, but Daniel had chosen a different creed. Mercy was heavier than gold, heavier than bullets, heavier than silence. And now, it was a weight he willingly carried. When dawn finally brushed the hills with light, Daniel blinked against the brightness, stiff and weary from the long vigil. The Apache woman still breathed, her chest rising steadily, her face less pale than before. He allowed himself a breath of relief, though he knew the danger was far from over. She was alive, but keeping her that way meant stepping into a storm that might change everything he thought he knew. Daniel Brooks, the cowboy who had nothing but dust and saddle scars to his name, had bound himself to a stranger's fate. And deep down in the quiet spaces of his heart, he sensed that this night was only the beginning of something that would test not just his courage, but his very soul. By the time the first colors of dawn stretched across the Arizona sky, Daniel's eyes burned from lack of sleep. He had spent the entire night tending the Apache woman, feeding the fire, checking her wound, and fighting off his own weariness. A man could ride days through the desert and not feel as tired as he did after one night of carrying someone else's life in his hands. His plan had been simple. Once the sun rose, he would ride on. She was alive, and perhaps strong enough to survive until her people found her. But plans made under the desert sky rarely stood against the will of fate. When she stirred, trying to sit upright, he reached out instinctively, steadying her before she could fall. Her hand clutched his arm, not in desperation but in determination, and in broken English she whispered, "You gave life. My people will not forget." Her words settled in him like an anchor. Daniel had never sought thanks, and yet the meaning in her voice was heavier than gratitude. She leaned against him as she rose, her body weak but her spirit unbroken. For a brief moment, he thought they could walk to safety, that he might help her find her way home. But as the first true rays of sunlight spilled across the hills, movement caught his eye. Figures appeared on the ridge, dark silhouettes against the gold of morning. Apache warriors, half a dozen at least, stood watching, their weapons gleaming faintly in the light. Daniel's stomach tightened. His rifle lay propped against a rock far beyond his reach. If they chose to end him, there was little he could do. He had saved one of theirs, but in the harsh logic of the frontier, that did not always matter. The woman steadied herself and stepped forward, her voice stronger now, though her body trembled. She raised a hand toward the men on the ridge, and they responded with a cry that carried down into the valley. Daniel braced himself, every muscle coiled, expecting arrows or bullets to follow. Instead, the men descended with measured steps, circling the campfire until Daniel stood surrounded. He held himself tall, refusing to show fear, though his heart pounded. One warrior stepped forward, his face painted, his eyes sharp and unreadable. The woman spoke quickly in her tongue, gesturing toward Daniel, her words flowing like a river. Though Daniel understood none of it, he felt the weight of her testimony. She was telling them what had happened, how he had risked his own life to give her another chance at hers. The circle parted, and from it emerged an older man, his presence commanding the silence of all around him. The chief. His face was weathered by sun and time, but his eyes were keen, carrying the weight of both judgment and wisdom. He studied Daniel for a long moment, as though searching his soul through his gaze. Daniel stood unflinching, refusing to lower his head. At last, the chief stepped forward, laying a hand firmly on his shoulder. The gesture startled Daniel more than any threat would have. The chief spoke, his English broken yet clear. "A man who gives more than gold, gives honor. He is no enemy." The warriors murmured in agreement, and Daniel felt the invisible noose of danger loosen around his neck. The woman turned her eyes on him then, not as a stranger, but as someone bound to him by something deeper than circumstance. In her look was gratitude, but also something unspoken, a promise that what had happened between them would not fade like dust in the wind. Daniel realized then that mercy had cost him nothing, and yet given him everything. He'd walked into that valley alone, but he would walk out carrying a bond that could never be bought or sold. As the warriors helped the woman mount a horse, the chief inclined his head toward Daniel. "Ride safe, cowboy. Our eyes will remember." It was not just permission, it was respect. Days later, back in town, whispers began to spread. Men spoke of the cowboy who had risked his life for a wounded Apache woman, of how her people had spared him and marked him as a man of honor. Some scoffed, calling it foolishness. Others looked at him with new regard. To many he had gained nothing, no land, no cattle, no gold. But to those who understood, he had gained something far rarer, trust. In a land where enemies were drawn by skin and tribe, Daniel Brooks had crossed an invisible line and found kinship where none thought it possible. He had not sought wealth, yet he had discovered a treasure in the respect of a people and the bond of a woman whose life had intertwined with his own. As the sun dipped low one evening, Daniel saddled his horse and prepared to ride again. The desert stretched before him, vast and merciless, yet no longer as lonely as it had once been. Somewhere out there, he knew, eyes remembered him, hearts carried his name, and fate had etched him into a story far larger than his own. He was no longer just a cowboy chasing silence and survival. He was a man tied to redemption, to honor, and to a love that had been born not from chance, but from choice. And in the wild, untamed West, that was worth more than all the gold in the world.